We all experience conflict in some way or another. Sometimes it's conflict between a parent and a child. And if you have children, you know the type of conflict can come in a family situation. Sometimes it's conflict between a husband and a wife. Sometimes it's conflict between your employer and you. Or sometimes it's just conflict with a neighbor. Or maybe it's just conflict with someone that you meet in a grocery store or in the bank. Sadly, sometimes we deal with conflict in the church. Surprise. Conflict. The challenging thing that comes up in all of this is how do we actually deal with conflict? How do we know when conflict is there, and how do we work through that in ways that are going to produce positive results? And so we're going to look at a number of different areas today, but I'm going to need your help on a couple of things that we're going to be talking about as we address this concept of tactics for leading in conflict. And so I want to ask you, what do you think are some of the sources of congregational conflict? When you think about church, say it again.
Pride.
Pride, okay.
Power.
Power.
Ego.
Opinions.
Personality.
Ego.
Hurt.
Slow down here, I can only write so fast. Personality, what was the other?
Hurt.
Hurt, okay.
Money. Miscommunication.
Communication.
Level of education or lack thereof.
Okay.
Inability to take criticism.
Oh.
Maturity. Breathing bodies.
Can I just sum that up as people? I heard it said one time, this leadership thing would be easy if it weren't for people. So there is a whole lot of truth in that. Anything else? Oh, yeah.
In the words of one of the world's greatest theologians, my 9-year-old granddaughter, she said, "It's easy, Grandpa. Just do what I want."
I'm going to put that down as this. Sometimes it's selfishness that creates conflict. You know, I was reading some articles in preparation for today and just some other things. And it's interesting to find out what people consider to be sources of congregational conflict. For example, members' behavior. And a lot of these fall into that. But it's the behavior of someone in the congregation. It may be the behavior I don't like, or maybe it's just behavior I don't agree with, or maybe it's just behavior that somehow I've determined is not doctrinally right. And so whatever it is, that behavior creates some kind of angst between us and them, and so there's conflict. Another area was money and worship. We had, I think, money up here already, but worship becomes a source of conflict. You know, I thought it was interesting this morning, and Joe, I think it was Joe that made reference to that. Joe in here? I saw him poke his head in here. He probably, oh, there he is right there. Talk about this idea of singing out. Well, I'm telling you, I've heard some people sing, and when they sing out, it creates conflict. It doesn't mean they shouldn't sing out. I'll never forget growing up as a kid that my dad was a preacher for a congregation in Missouri, and he converted this guy and his family. And if there was ever anybody that, as I heard growing up, couldn't carry a tune in a bucket, it was this guy. I mean, you couldn't sing sitting next to him. And I was complaining about it one time and kind of making fun of him as a kid. And my dad said, "You need to not do that. Because he may be the very one that genuinely is worshiping God because everybody else is just concerned about what it sounds like." And I thought, okay, that didn't go over so well. Then we had conflict. But, you know, sometimes it's worship. And have we experienced any conflict when it comes to the aspect of worship over the last 3 years? I mean, you know, I kind of get on my soapbox about the styrofoam and NyQuil. I just have some issues with whatever that is. But it's not unleavened bread. It's some kind of styrofoam disc And I just can't do it. I'm sorry. And then the NyQuil tasting stuff. You know, you can refrigerate those things so that they don't taste like they're filled with alcohol. But people let them sit out there in those baskets all week long, and it's kind of like. So even sometimes worship can create conflict. Leadership style. I am working on some material that I really want to dig more into this, especially when it comes to the church, is this idea of leadership style. Because there are all kinds of different styles of leadership. And I think the thing that's challenging is that oftentimes people have this concept of thinking, well, this is my style of leadership. And if you've ever had an opportunity to read Heifetz's material on adaptive leadership, we have to realize that sometimes the circumstance demands that the style of leadership changes.
Yes.
You can't use one style of leadership for every situation that exists in the church. And so leadership and the style of leadership can be a great source of conflict that exists. Because it's amazing to me how many people think they know exactly how the leaders need to be doing things until they become a leader. And then it's like, whoa. This is not what I anticipated or expected. And so they're involved in conflict. And then decision making. Because what happens if you don't make the decision that I want you to make? We've got conflict. And that's the way that works. Because everybody is an advocate of their own position. They want to do things the way that they think they should be done. And I appreciate you saying that about your granddaughter, because everything would be great if you just do it my way, right? And that's exactly the way people think in the church. And so when decisions are made, whether that is from the leadership or as a congregation as a whole, in whatever method that is, that decision-making process oftentimes leaves us with conflict. So, I've been reading this book, and if you get a chance, I would really recommend it, by Adam Grant. It's called Think Again. I wished I had read this book before I wrote my book, because I would have incorporated a lot of his material in it. He talks about, why is it that I avoid conflict? So he started examining himself and the whole concept of why he avoided conflict. And then he started talking to others about why do you avoid conflict? And it was very interesting, the list that he put together, and you can see here, I didn't put the percentages up there. You can see that a small percentage says, well, I try to avoid conflict to save time. And maybe that's where a lot of people are, especially in leadership. And then there are those who say, well, it might save the friendship. Let's just not have the conflict because I want us to remain friends. So it'd be better for me to lie to you to save our friendship than for us to have conflict. And then it might not help for us to argue. Isn't it interesting how that we equate conflict with an argument? But it's this last one that is the bulk of this pie chart. And that is, I don't want anyone to be mad at me. When leaders come into a position, especially within the church, that they're going to try to please everyone in the congregation because they don't want anyone to be mad at them, they're going to deal with some conflict of magnitude I'm not sure they're going to want to deal with. And I think in part that's why we struggle to get people interested in even serving in leadership roles within the church today. Because they know there's going to be conflict and they do everything in their power to try and avoid that conflict so that nobody will be angry with them. So why does conflict exist? I'm going to try to get a better marker here if we can. There it is. I taught in this class earlier last year, and you'd think I would have remembered that. Maybe this marker works better. We'll see. Why does conflict exist?
Breathing bodies.
Okay, people.
Grandpa won't do it my way.
All right. Say it again. All right.
Free will.
All right, free will.
Personal pride.
Yeah, we come back to pride again on that.
Miscommunication.
Communication. You guys are going to love this class.
A lot of times anymore, it has to do with what generation you are.
Ooh. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Tim Elmore. Tim Elmore is the founder of a company called growingleaders.com, and has written a number of books that deal with really how to lead this next generation. How do you deal with getting this next generation to a point that they are able to lead? And his material is really, really good. And one of the things that he recently coined is we understand this idea of IQ, intelligent quotient. And real popular thing right now in leadership is emotional intelligence, EQ. And he coined what he's calling GQ, generational quotient. And the thing that he talks about is the fact that in any organization, doesn't matter what it is, and we especially see it in the church, that any one given time you're dealing with 5 different generations of people. And that the reality is the younger generation does not have a clue how to interact or deal with an older generation. Now, I started there because the opposite is just as true. It's very difficult for the older generation to understand the younger generation. And the challenge for us is we're often trying to fix them because we think they need to be like we want them to be. And guess what that creates? Conflict. This generational gap that exists in the church is very difficult. And a lot of conflict is a result of the fact that you have these different generations of people that are all coming together. Imagine the task of the preacher. He's got to be able to deliver a message every week that connects with all 5 of those generations. And when he doesn't, guess what? One of them or more is not going to like it, and it's going to create conflict.
I guess it builds on differing views, but more basically is the source of truth. To what extent, if any, is doctrinal deviation or digression to be allowed?
All right.
I think that the different views can sometimes come from a selfish, I want it my way aspect, but I also think sometimes conflict comes from people who both parties may have great intentions and want the best for their church or whoever's involved, but I still think that it causes conflict sometimes when there's just different views. I mean,
Yeah.
even though the intentions are great, because they both, like you said, they think something needs to be fixed, or they want what's best for something, or they think they know the best way to do something.
Yeah, so true. Cultural differences. And we are really, in this country especially, dealing with this. The cultural differences that exist from, maybe it's a racial issue, or maybe it's just one part of the country to the other. And having studied a lot about culture in the years past, it's interesting to me that cultures are so different even within the same country. We would understand that the culture in the U.S. is different than the culture in Europe or in India or Africa or Central or South America. We understand that those cultures would be different. But even within this country, we have cultural differences. I mean, I can tell you, having lived in Louisiana, that the people in the north part of the state are nothing like the people in the south part of the state. The people in the north part of the state are more like Arkansans, because I was from Arkansas, so I kind of related more to those people in the north. I couldn't even understand the language of the people in the south. The cultures were so different. And think about it from this perspective. People on the West Coast in California, the culture there is far, far different than the culture on the East Coast in Virginia. Culture in the north, culture to the south, even within Texas. There are people in East Texas that won't do anything with the folks in West Texas. I mean, it's just this concept of culture. And what's interesting is even within the church, you have different cultures. And that does create conflict.
Cultural conflict, I'm sorry. Is that the same as societal?
It could be. They're certainly related to the idea of society and things that are going on in society. Because the culture that we might associate with society affects our younger generation different than it does our older generation. which is why marketing agencies make so much money in trying to figure out how to target the people that are going to spend money on the products. What else? What else creates conflict? Why does it exist? Politics. Okay?
We take our focus off Christ
Ooh.
and put it on issues or people.
You noticed I didn't stay on that politics thing very long. I don't get into the politics thing. That can go down south in a hurry. But you're right about the idea of, we lose focus on Christ. And when that loss of focus on Christ exists and we get more focused on people, we tend to have to deal with conflict. There are some others, and we're going to talk some more about other things in regards to this, but I'll share with you some ideas that really, to me, kind of summarize a lot of what we've been talking about and some areas that I have looked at in years past. One of the reasons that conflict exists is because we cannot control all situations. And we are a control-driven people. We like to control, and we want to own things, and we want to have that influence over people so that we can control them. And when we can't control all those things, then conflict is going to naturally result. And you see this in homes between parents and children. Parents want to control the decisions that their children make. And when they can't control that, then oftentimes it results in conflict between the parent and the child. And it's true in a lot of different situations beside the home, but when we can't control those situations, then conflict is going to be the result. Another one is we live in a very complex and diverse world. When I grew up, we never locked the door on our house. And it was so foreign to me. When we moved to Canada, it was required by law that you lock your car. Now, naturally today, that's just a given. But when we first moved to Canada, we never locked our car. But when we first moved there, somebody told us it's a law. That if the police officer is walking through the parking lot and he lifts the door handle on your car and it opens the door, you're going to get a $75 ticket. They got tired of dealing with theft. And so they figured the best way to do it was to get people to lock their doors and made it a law. And so that's a whole different world than I grew up in. I lived in a world where every kid on the block played together. You never worried about somebody coming by and offering you candy and scooping you up and taking you away. That wasn't a concept. We never heard of mass school shootings or shootings at the mall. We live in a very complex world and a very diverse world. And this country is becoming more diverse by the moment. And that creates a lot of conflict, maybe even from the political scene all the way down. We see that becoming a great reason. People. You got to deal with people. And when you're dealing with people, guess what? There's not two people in this room that grew up in the exact same home, with the exact same education, with the exact same influences, with the exact same culture. We're all different. And because we're all different, it's hard for us sometimes to accept the fact that there are differences. And as a result, it creates culture or creates a conflict in our relationships. And so those are just a few of the reasons. And I think there's another one that we kind of touched on. We're going to touch more on it later, is poor communication. It's amazing to me, for all the technological advances that we have, we are worse at communicating today than we've ever been in history. In March of about 2009, maybe 10. No, it was 2009. I had 17 teenagers at our home in Colorado that were visiting from Greenbrier, Arkansas, coming to go on a ski trip on their spring break. It snowed about 1.5 feet before they got there, or right after they got there, so they couldn't go skiing, so they were all over our house. All over our house. And it fascinated me that teenagers sitting across the table from each other would not talk to one another. They were texting one another. And I'm like, do you not want to talk? Oh, yeah. Fastest thumbs in the West. They were getting after it. And I'm like, why don't you just talk to one another? It's so much easier. But we don't do that. Communication. But the biggest reason why conflict exists today Now that wasn't supposed to happen that way. Here we go. Change. The biggest reason why we have conflict today is because of change. And we do not like those 6 letters. We don't like change. And I get it. It's funny to me, there are some things that I really do like to change. And some things I don't like. Now, depending on your political position, if you're on the left and there is somebody on the right in office, then you like it when there is a change and the person becomes left. Or if you're on the right and somebody that's on the left is in office and that change takes place and somebody on the right is elected, then you like that change. Now, I used to say that I've never met anybody that ever said when they got a raise, I can't handle that change. I can't handle that kind of financial change in my life, so please don't give me that. I used to say that, and I did that one time with a workshop, and somebody said, we know somebody. I said, are you serious? And they said, yeah. So they got this big raise, and they went back to the boss and said, look, that's going to put me in a different tax bracket, and I don't want to pay more in tax. And I'm thinking, okay, I've never heard of such a thing. That's bizarre. I've never been in that tax bracket, so I don't guess I'm worried. But the thing is we don't mind economic change if it's going to be in a positive direction for us. You know, as a parent, when our kids were growing up, I really liked to see them change, where they got to where they could feed themselves. That was a nice change. When I didn't have to change a diaper, that was a nice change. When they got to where they were able to put their own clothes on, that was a nice change. You know, there were a lot of things that when they started to change, I really liked. But then, of course, there are other things that changed I didn't like. Now, I will tell you, I'm a routine kind of guy. I have a routine. I like to get up the same time every day. I like to go to bed the same time every night. And I usually eat just about the same thing every day. Except when I'm traveling. Yep. You know, I like that routine. That's something, and it's amazing to me that it doesn't take but just a simple change of having to spring forward in the spring and to fall backward in the fall, 1 hour that messes up that whole routine. 1 hour. Who would have thought? It takes me a week to adjust my sleep schedule after that 1 hour daylight saving time change. Now we can thank Benjamin Franklin for that. That was something he introduced about 239 years ago. And you want to know why he introduced it? It had to do with economics, it had to do with money. It was about saving candles, saving money in candles. You know that if we would just change the clock by 1 hour, you wouldn't have to spend as much money burning candles in the evening. Now with the invention of electricity, we don't have that problem. So why is it that we continue to do something 239 years later, even though the reason for which it was implemented no longer exists? It's because we don't like change. And in the church, we like it even less. We don't like change. And it's funny to me because when we think about this idea of change, why do you think people are so resistant to it?
Scares them.
Okay. Give me just a second here.
Forces them to think.
Hold on. So it scares them.
Forces them to think.
Okay. We're going to have to invest in some dry erase markers.
They may have to give up control.
Oh, okay.
They're comfortable.
I'm sorry?
They're comfortable.
Oh, that's one of my favorite words.
Slippery slope.
You know? So true. Slippery slope. Why are people so resistant? Huh?
They have to change with it.
Oh, okay. They have to change with it?
I'll throw this out. It's a loss.
Ah, yes.
To lose. And I don't mean like an argument. I mean like I have to lose a way that my grandparents did it. It's a loss.
Yeah.
And maybe I connected that to something bigger than the thing.
And people go through the stages of grief.
Yes, it's a grief.
Yeah, when they experience that kind of loss, they go through the fear and the anger and the denial, and then finally, a lot of times they don't, but sometimes they reach that point of acceptance. But
adapt to a new environment situation.
It's prone to cause division.
okay,
I think fear, or scare.
fear. I started to put that here, what scares them, but yeah, same idea. So it does. It creates a lot of fear. People are afraid of change and what it's going to bring.
But they're afraid, too, that we'll forget the way it was.
Oh, okay.
They like tradition.
And tradition in and of itself is not bad. But sometimes that fear of changing the tradition becomes very difficult.
Sometimes people are resistant to change because they don't understand why the leaders are making that change.
Ah,
So again, back to communication.
Or
somebody said unknown, the fear of the unknown.
not agreeing with the reason for change.
Okay.
Nothing wrong. If it was good for my grandchild.
Yeah, nothing wrong.
Presentation.
Say it again.
Poor presentation.
Ah, okay.
The benefit to the change.
I'm sorry.
That's the benefit.
Okay.
Could be obstinate. Attitude.
Attitude. Okay. Isn't it interesting? There's so many different reasons that people are resistant to change. And I want to share with you some ideas that, to me, I've read so much material on this, and I've done this with a lot of congregations. In fact, some of the congregations that are in here have been through this before. But it's interesting to me that one of the reasons is what I call the Chicken Little complex. It's this, we assume the worst. It's so rare for somebody to say, you know, this change is going to make this so much better. I mean, in the church context, we always think that the change is going to bring about the worst. In fact, I was working with a congregation one time, and I kept going through material about change and the need for us to change. I'm not talking about changing doctrine. I'm not talking about changing our worship. I'm not talking about changing any of those things. But there are some things in our methodology that may need to change. And so I kept saying the word change, and this guy kind of got red in the face, and he finally just said, I wished you would stop saying that. And I'd say, why? And he said, because every time you say the word change, I think we're going liberal. And I'm like, why? Why do we think that way? Now, I get it. I understand that there have been congregations in the past that have made changes, and as soon as they started the changes, the next thing you know, they're in left field. I get that. But not all change is like that. But what happens is we've seen that, and so in order to not allow that to happen, we run in the opposite direction, do everything we can to stop even using the word. And yet what cracks me up is we preach change every week. We just use a different word. Well, transformation or repent. I'm like, do you know what that word means? Repent means change. You got to change your mind. You got to change your actions. You got to make change. But people just assume the worst when we start using that. And so it's like the sky is falling. The next thing you know, this is going to be so bad. Another reason is because of the communication breakdown. And we've talked some about that. It's this fear versus faith thing. And the way I heard it described in an article by Charles Stone was this idea that knowledge gaps, thank you so much. I don't need any of them now, but anyway, I appreciate that. The idea is that the knowledge gaps are filled with fear instead of faith. The way I've seen changes implemented many times in congregations is one Sunday morning, somebody gets up and says, next week we're going to stop doing this. Or we're going to start doing this. And people in the congregation are like, when did they make that decision? Who made that decision? Why did they make that decision? Did they not ask any of us? I mean, people start getting afraid because they don't have information. And that communication breakdown creates fear instead of faith. If we could communicate things, it would change a lot. Another reason is emotional connections. And I think this is part of what Joe was talking about, this idea of loss. People get so emotionally connected to the programs they're involved in or activities they participate in. And when we change those things, then what happens is they experience this fear of loss. And so they become reactionary to that. They get very resistant. I mean, how many of y'all have a vacation Bible school at your congregation where you're at? A lot of you. Imagine if you were to come in one Sunday, no prep, you just got up and said, we're not going to do VBS this year, we're not going to do it ever again. Well, let me tell you, you got some folks in the congregation that are going to feel a great deal of resistance to that because that's their baby. That's what they've been doing for 50 years. How can you think about not doing that? Even though using it may not be effective anymore. But we are emotionally tied to that. I met with a congregation one time. They were asking about some changes that needed to be made. And I was like, okay. They were meeting in a building that would seat about 350 people. And they had 12. I said, what's the building worth? So they told me, and I said, well, my suggestion would be that you should sell this building and that you should use that money to hire an evangelist to come down here and help evangelize and build this congregation up and then maybe get a different building. He was baptized in that building in 1973, and that's the only place he'd ever known. He was emotionally connected. And so it was very reactionary, and it was very difficult to want to say, we're not going to do that. Another reason behind this is it's threatening. Changes are seen as threatening, and so it's that fight or flight syndrome. And so people, when they notice that change is coming, or it's been implemented, or it's been announced in some way, then what happens is they're either going to fight you, or they're going to leave and go somewhere else. Neither of which are good. And so change, it's just so difficult when we think about how do we deal with change and the conflict that comes from it. Now, I do want to share with you, there are two types of change that exists. One that I call forced, and the other is initiated. Forced change takes place when people are unprepared and they're not expecting it. To give you some examples of forced change, COVID-19. In 2020, in March, when churches across this country were shut down and not allowed to meet in their buildings, that forced us into some change that we were not prepared for. We didn't expect. And all the changes that have come from it. Somebody mentioned earlier the idea of division. I've known more congregations that have experienced division over whether to wear a mask or not wear a mask than anything I've ever heard of. Even over doctrinal matters. And I'm like, are we Christians? Now, let me just say, brother or sister, if it's going to make you feel comfortable for me to wear a mask, I'm going to wear it. Even if I don't have to, if it makes you comfortable, I'm going to wear it. Because I want you here. But it amazed me, the elders that I talked to that were so overwhelmed. They couldn't make a decision that was right because every decision they made was only 50% right. If they said, you got to wear a mask, then half the congregation said, we ain't coming. And if they said, well, you don't have to wear a mask, it's optional, then the other half said, we're not coming. You see, we were forced into a situation of conflict that created all kinds of problems. But there are other things that force change in our lives that oftentimes create conflict that we're not prepared for, we're not expecting. For example, a tsunami, a volcano eruption, a tornado, a hurricane. Natural disasters oftentimes create conflict or change in places that result in conflict that it's because people weren't expecting it. They weren't prepared for that. How about a terminal diagnosis? Somebody is told you have cancer and you only have a short period of time to live. Well, we're not expecting that. We're not prepared for that. When that happens, It causes all kinds of things to change in our life. And a lot of conflict can result from that. And the list goes on and on. I mean, you get the idea of what I'm talking about here. The other initiated change is where people are prepared and they're expecting the change. You want to know the major difference between these two? Communication. That is the major difference in these two areas. So I want to talk about 2 tactics, if you will, for how to lead in conflict. I have a book downstairs on the salt table. If you're interested in reading that, you can see it down there. But I developed 7 tactics for leading in the zones, as I refer to it. And I'm going to share 2 of them with you. We don't have time to do all 7 of them. And if you'd like to know more about them, you can see them in the book. But the first one is Recon. I had the privilege of interviewing 6 different military leaders across this country. One from every branch. I had a colonel in the Air Force. I had an admiral in the Navy. I had a 2-star general from the Army. And I had a Marine major that I had the opportunity to interview these guys. And it was so insightful to me. And a large part of that time in those interviews, in my mind, I'm thinking, why aren't we doing this stuff in the church? I mean, military branches got a pretty good perspective on how to develop leaders. Why aren't we doing more of these kinds of things, or at least applying some of the principles that are used in the church? It would be so helpful. So I've employed some of them. I should say employed. I've asked some of them to volunteer to help develop some material that we're going to put on the website that I encourage you to go to, and you'll be able to find that material that's going to involve developing leaders within congregations. And so I really appreciate their help. It's going to be very, very beneficial, I think, to congregations. But this idea of Recon came about because as some of you may know, General Greg Cheney. He lives, I think, in Abilene, or at least close to Abilene. But Greg Cheney is an awesome guy. I really appreciate him. And he said, no plan exists without reconnaissance. You got to have reconnaissance. And so I was writing this material, and I had 3 different areas that I was looking at developing on this particular point. My daughter says, you should call it Recon. And I'm thinking, Recon? I like that. Because the idea is we're going to have to rethink some things. If we're going to work through and lead people in a situation of conflict, we're going to have to do some rethinking. There's this cognitive battle that goes on in our minds of how we are going to deal with leading people. And so we're going to have to rethink some things. Now, I mentioned earlier the book about Think Again that's written by Adam Grant. And Adam Grant talks about this concept of rethinking. And it was so beautiful. He puts this pie chart up. And it says the most annoying things people say instead of rethinking. Rethinking maybe their position, maybe rethinking their attitude, rethinking their decision. And he says, you know, you got this small percentage of people who are going to say, that will never work here. Mm-hmm. I don't know how many times I worked in Arkansas for 11 years with a congregation there. And we had one gentleman, and it didn't matter what was brought up. Every time something new was introduced to try to do to help create some growth or excitement in the congregation, he'd say, nope, it won't work here. We tried that 50 years ago. It didn't work then and it won't work now. And I'm like, somebody take him out back and shoot him. He's done. I mean, he was such a negative influence on the direction of that congregation. I'm like, why do we do that? Then there's a percentage of people say, that's not what my experience has shown. You see, they're not going to rethink it because, well, I've already had some experience in this. And my experience has shown, and then they go on with their explanation. Then there's a percentage of people say, that's too complicated. Let's not overthink it. I love that one. But you know, the biggest percentage of the pie here is probably the curse that we face today. That's the way we've always done it. It doesn't matter that it's ineffective anymore or that our society or culture has changed in such a way that our methodology is no longer effective. It's like this is the way we've always done it. Now I'm going to ask you some questions that I really want you to think seriously about. This idea of, are we willing to rethink some things? Now I want to state up front, and I want to be very clear so that you do not misunderstand. I am not advocating, nor will I ever advocate, that we change anything in God's Word. Amen. That's not going to happen. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about our methods, our approaches, maybe some of our practices. we may need to rethink those things. And so I'm going to ask you to think about that as we go through this concept of rethinking 3 areas. Number 1, we're going to have to rethink how we communicate. Now, it's already been brought up several times that one of the reasons for resistance and one of the reasons that conflict exists, poor communication, the lack of communication, on and on the list goes. Let me tell you, communication is challenging, even when we speak the same language. And the reason for that is because there are 6 messages that take place every time we speak. There's what I think I say, and then there's what I actually say. Then there's what the other person hears me say, and then there's what they think they heard me say. And then there's what they say they think they heard me say. And then there's what I hear them say about what they think they heard me say in the first place. It's complicated to try to communicate. And to make matters worse, the means with which we try to communicate is usually electronic. I had a guy call me, congregation up north, and they were dealing with all kinds of difficulties. And they had let a preacher go, and they basically didn't tell the congregation very minimal information about why they let him go, and they didn't really explain the full reason behind it, and it upset a lot of people. Well, so what they did was they sat down and wrote a letter and sent it to everybody in the congregation. And so when they were talking to me, they said, what should we have done? I said, well, number 1, don't send a letter. You see, effective communication or communicating effectively oftentimes does not work well in written form. Nor do I like the idea of announcements. I don't know when you do announcements in your congregation, before or at the end of service, but generally speaking, most people don't listen. I'm not saying all, but most people don't listen. They're either trying to settle in and get ready for the worship service, or they're packing up and trying to get ready to leave. And we're trying to make announcements. So I know there are some things, as kind of trivial things, you can tell about the youth events and you can tell about the potlucks and those kind of things that are going to happen. You know, stuff that you put in a bulletin. People, they just don't read stuff anymore. Even in emails, don't send emails. I mean, it's been so funny the last few days that I've talked to a number of people here on staff that talk about how frustrating it is. They send emails out and people don't read them because the information's in the email. And I'm like, I have that all the time. The worst part is nobody responds to the email. So I don't even know if you got it. And I'm like, I'm waiting on a response. And people don't ever read them. Texting, I don't even understand texting language. You know, the abbreviations that people use, I'm just like, I can't even figure out what you're trying to say to me. Call me on the phone or talk to me face to face. You see, the most effective way, and this was the thing about all these military people I interviewed, every single one of them said the most effective way to communicate is face to face. Because here's what happens. If we're going to make a change in the congregation, let's say we're not going to do Vacation Bible School anymore, or we're going to fire the preacher, or we're going to hire a new one. How effective would it be for me to sit down and say, Tyler, I want to talk to you about something that we're looking to do. And I'm going to explain to you how this is going to work. I'm going to tell you why we're making this change. And I'm going to explain who's going to be involved in this. And I'd like for you to think about how you might support it. Now that does a couple of things. One, it's going to show him that I valued him enough to sit down and talk to him face to face and not let him hear it from the pulpit. Number 2, it's going to give him an opportunity to ask some questions. Because the most important thing about communication is understanding. I don't know if you understand something that I read to you from the pulpit. And if I send it to you in an email and you don't read it, then there's a good chance you have no understanding of what's about to take place. And so the best way is to sit down and talk to people face to face and just ask them to share any thoughts they have or to give some questions that they might have in regards to what's going to take place. Now, does that take more time? Absolutely. Is it more difficult? Yes. It just depends on if you want the change to be forced or initiated. Because people are much less resistant to change when you've had an opportunity to talk to them face to face before you make that change and get their feedback. And let them ask those questions. You can almost eliminate the majority of conflict by that face-to-face communication. So when it comes to this idea of how do we lead through conflict, I think we just need to start with rethinking our methods of communication. and stop trying to communicate things in a way that's convenient or what we consider to be more efficient. I know a congregation, I encouraged them, I pleaded with them that when they got ready to tell people about their vision statement, that they sit down with every member of the family in the congregation and talk to them about it. They chose not to do that because it was going to take too much time. So what they decided to do is they had the preacher preach a sermon on it. And it divided the congregation. Because half those people felt offended that they weren't involved in the discussion at all. They weren't asked to come to the meeting. And so they took offense. Now, there were some underlying problems that existed prior to that, but that just put fuel on the fire. And as a result, that congregation now is 2 congregations about a half a mile apart. Communication would have solved all of that if they would have taken the time to have sat down and talked to people face to face. So we're going to have to rethink how we communicate. Number 2, we're going to have to rethink how we operate. Now, this is where this gets a little challenging. How do we operate? Have we ever stopped to think why we do what we do when we do it? No, we don't. We don't.
We did 50 years ago.
Yeah. I want to say, I'm never in favor of the church meeting less. In my opinion, the church ought to meet more. But there needs to be a purpose behind why we are assembling and meeting. And if we can't explain to people why we're doing what we do, then don't be surprised if a majority of people are not interested in coming to that. Now, let me just give you an example. I met with a group of elders one time, and I noticed that their attendance on Sunday morning was a certain number. Sunday night, about half. On Wednesday night, they had about 30% of their congregation coming back. And so I asked them, I said, why is that? Why do you have 30% coming back on Wednesday night that you have Sunday morning? Well, we have this guy over here, his son's a golfer, and so they take him to golf practice on that night. And this family over here, their daughter's in some kind of school event, so they take her to do that. And this family over here, and they started making all these things. And I said, well, wait a minute, let me ask you a question. I said, if you found out that if you changed the time that you met on Wednesday night, from Wednesday night to Thursday night at 7 o'clock, and you could get 75% of the people back, would you make that change? And they said no. Now, I get the same response. I get people shaking their heads like, why on earth would they say that? Here was his reason. We've always met on Wednesday night at this time, and if people are spiritual, they will make the sacrifice. Now, I'll tell you, I don't always engage my clutch very well, but I blurted out, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard in my life. You're going to put the tradition of meeting on Wednesday night at this time above the education, biblical education and equipping of your people for making that change? Why would we do that? And then I asked him, how would you even find out? And the one elder hung his head and he said, I guess we'd have to ask. What a novel concept. Have we ever considered why do we meet on Wednesday night at the time we meet? And is it the most effective time? It may be. I'm not saying to change it. I'm saying, would we even be willing to have the conversation to figure out what is the most effective way for us to equip the saints to do the work of service? If we're only getting 30% there, we're not doing an effective job. Are we willing to figure out? I know one congregation during the pandemic that met 4 nights during the week. They wanted to make sure that everybody in the congregation had an opportunity to be taught something in the Bible. And so they didn't require everybody to come every time during the week. They just said, if you can't come Monday, then come Tuesday. And if you can't come those, then come on Wednesday. And if you can't come one of those, then Thursday night we'll be here. Would we be willing to make those kinds of changes? When I worked with a church in Canada, we met on Sunday afternoons at 3 o'clock. I love him already. I don't even know who it was. We met on Sunday afternoons at 3 o'clock. And it was so cool. And I'll tell you why. We had worship first. We had Bible class after. And then we had a potluck almost every week. So we ended up spending somewhere around 3 to 4 or 5 hours together. The thing that was so cool about it is that when we would meet people in town and we'd say, hey, my name is Bob Turner. I'm with the Church of Christ. We'd like to invite you to come worship with us. Oh, I'm sorry, we have our own church. I know. Y'all meet at 10 o'clock. We meet at 3, so you got no excuse. You can come. I mean, why do we meet at 9 or 9:30 or 10 or 10:30 on Sundays? I mean, is that the most effective time? It may be. But are we willing to think about how we operate, and are we operating at the most effective level to accomplish the kingdom work that we're trying to accomplish as God's people? Are we going to allow something that's been in place or something that's been structured a certain way that has no biblical precedent to it? Are we going to allow that to dictate something that might keep us from being more effective? Now again, I'm not saying we meet less. I would rather see us meet all day. But are we willing to rethink how we operate? And is it the most effective way so that we can be the most effective that we can be for God and His kingdom?
Amen.
Again, I'm not talking about changing the message. Message doesn't change. The way I live doesn't change. The way I'm going to worship isn't going to change. But can I be more effective? And am I willing to evaluate what that might look like in order to move forward? So we have to rethink that. And I did say 4:15, didn't I? We have to also rethink how we negotiate. Here's where it's at. Negotiating. If you ever get a chance to read Chris Voss's book, Never Split the Difference, Negotiating as if your life depended on it, that's such a great book. And this idea of negotiation is not compromise. So don't think that when I say we need to rethink how we negotiate, that I'm talking about compromising. We're not compromising God's Word here. We're trying to get people to yes. That's another great book if you ever get a chance to read it, is Getting to Yes. How do we get people to know that they need to move in this direction? Well, that's a negotiation. Everything in life is a negotiation. And learning to have what he refers to in this book as tactical empathy. To have the kind of empathy of knowing what this person is thinking and why they're thinking that way, and how can we utilize that story to get them engaged in a conversation to move them from where they are to where they need to be. Now, as an FBI negotiator, Chris Voss was very skilled in that, and his book details that information in a great way. But in the church, it's not this idea of my way or the highway, because once we come up with that thinking and we come across with that way, then people are like, nope, I'm taking the highway. But how can we negotiate with them to help them take the steps that will move them from where they are to where they need to be? And so that methodology of how we teach and our approach to people may need to be different. And I'll tell you why. When you get the opportunity to look at the difference between Acts 2 and Acts 17, it's very important to know the difference in those two texts. When you look at the sermon preached by Peter in Acts chapter 2, you're going to find that about 52% of that sermon is book, chapter, and verse. Who was he preaching to? Jews. Now, guess what? Had he not used those prophecies and those passages from the Old Testament, those people would not have accepted that message. Correct. But he showed proof from that Old Testament text that Jesus was the Messiah they'd been looking for. When you get to Acts chapter 17, Paul is preaching at Mars Hill. He doesn't use not even one passage from the Old Testament. Who's he preaching to? Greeks. They had no concept of understanding, nor would they have been willing to follow something that was given to the Jews. And so what he did is he quotes from some of their own poets to convince them that Jesus was the Christ who had been raised from the dead. The message was the same. Jesus died for your sins. He's been buried and he's been raised from the dead. The difference between those two is very much what we're facing in our own generation in this world. In my lifetime, 61 years ago, if you didn't use book, chapter, and verse to teach people out here in the world, they wouldn't have listened to you. You had to show proof and evidence. But now the culture is such that most people, not only most of them, denying, and it scares me to death that a lot of people in the church are now going in that way, younger generation, that are denying the existence of God. But they're challenging the Bible as being the authority of God for our lives. So when I go to them and I say, well, Acts 2:38 says this, they're like, so? They don't believe it to be God's Word, and they may are even questioning whether God exists. So our approach may have to be different. It's very relational in the world that we live in today. And if we don't build a relationship in which you can trust me and that you can see the power of God at work in my life, then I'm never going to be able to reach you. It really is a relational culture, and we're going to have to learn how to build those relationships. Years ago when I was in school, I remember a guy coming and talking about friendship evangelism. And he talked about how that the majority of people are Christians today because of a friend or a family member. 95% plus. It's about relationships. And that's what he was trying to tell us. You got to build relationships. And so we need to rethink how we communicate, how we operate, how we negotiate. And real quickly, I want to tell you about this last piece. Mission training. There are two parts here. One is, do people even understand the mission that we're involved in? You know, sometimes we have this idea, or at least an expectation, in which we think people already know what the mission is they're supposed to be involved in. But I'm telling you, a lot of people don't. They don't understand the mission. Now, I understand, and they would probably tell you they know that we're to seek and save the lost. But Ephesians chapter 4 has one of the greatest mission statements I know in Scripture. You know, Jesus or God placed some in the church as apostles, some as prophets, some as evangelists, some as pastors, teachers, for the equipping of the saints, for the work of service, to the building up of the body of Christ, till we all attain a unity of the faith.
Amen.
We haven't been doing a very good job of fulfilling that mission. And a part of the reason is because of the second part of this, and that is training. Now, I want you to listen very, very carefully to what I'm about to say, because I am not against evangelism. I am not against evangelism. I know the Great Commission. And I know that the only way people are going to come to know Christ is if they know the Word of God that we have been entrusted with. I understand all of that. But I have attended evangelism conferences. I have sat through classes on evangelism. I've seen Fishers of Men. I've seen Does It Matter? I've seen home Bible studies. I've seen all the stuff. And the church today is not bigger, it's not stronger than it was before all that stuff happened. My conviction is that if we don't focus on leadership, somebody mentioned the idea earlier in a class about the idea of we're going to have to raise up evangelistic leaders if we're going to get the church to be involved in evangelism. You see, in the church, we're going to have to be about training people for the mission. I don't know about here with your congregation, wherever you're from, but the number one thing I get when I ask people your greatest needs as a congregation is we need more teachers. You know, getting a class in church is kind of like an eternity, because now you're locked in until Christ comes back, or until you die, and then we'll find somebody else. And the idea is we have such a hard time training or getting people to teach a class. And if it's an adult class, even more so. I mean, like, if I had the time, I'd go around the room and ask everybody what they did for a living. Because it's amazing to me that we take people who are involved in so many different facets of life that have no connection to either education or Bible training. We're like, would you teach a Bible class? And it's like, no. I'll take the sermon. At least it's only 30 minutes, right? I don't want the Bible class. It's an hour. But have we ever thought about taking the time to train people to do the work?
Yes.
I mean, actually having a class where we're involved in developing people to learn how to teach, and not just giving them, well, you be a co-teacher with me. Sit in the class with me for 6 months and I'll give it to you. It's like, no thanks. That's not working either. I'm talking about genuinely having people who know how to teach someone else how to teach a class. And have them come in and work with the congregation for a year, or maybe 18 months, and to equip some people. Because every time I've asked the question, I've had people say that when you ask them, if I were going to offer you a class for the next year to help equip you to teach a class, would you be willing to take the course? And everybody says, yeah, I'd be willing to do that. Now, I get it. Not everybody's going to be a teacher, not thinking that everybody should be. But wouldn't it make a difference if we equip them and train them to do the work that they're supposed to be doing? If we would think about how do we lead through conflict, there are more tactics and there's more information, but if we would just rethink how we communicate, how we operate, how we negotiate, and if we would do some mission training, I think it would make a powerful difference in the way that we approach this whole concept. Well, y'all been very, very good to listen to me for the last hour. Tomorrow afternoon, we're going to talk about lead like a shepherd. And we're going to talk about that role and what that involves, and how do you lead like a shepherd should lead. So we'll talk about that. But thank you for being in here today. I appreciate all the the feedback and stuff, and thanks for bringing the markers, Don. I wished I'd have had them at the start of class, but anyway.
Use them tomorrow.
Use them tomorrow. But appreciate y'all so much. I think we're supposed to be downstairs. Yes. Yes.
The last author at the about negotiation.
Chris Boss, B-O-S-S. It never split the difference. You bet. But thank y'all so much.